Zinzin speaking for about 35 to 40 minutes, where we can all learn. And meanwhile, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop in the chat. But also, we'll be having an open discussion. So you could save them for the open discussion where Vasudha will allow everyone to have camera and mic access. You can directly raise your hand and virtual hand, or raise your hand if your video is on, and we'll pass the mic to you. And you can ask questions, and we can have a free-flowing open discussion based on what we learned from Zinzin. So I think, yeah, over to you, Zinzin.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for letting me join you today. Most of you are probably in the very end of your Friday afternoon. For me, it's my morning. So the sun has not come up yet. I'm talking to you from around the world. And I'm right now going to share my screen with you all. So please let me know if it doesn't work. 1 second. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. Yeah. So right now, before we start, of course, we are going to be discussing a movement that grew in the region that we all call the North Country. And it's really the northeast of Turtle Island. And Turtle Island is what the original indigenous communities call North America. And to begin, I would like to first discuss or acknowledge that the land on which I myself stand is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee people, specifically the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation. I also acknowledge that as my role as a settler on this territory, I honor those who have fulfilled their roles and responsibilities towards this land and water since time immemorial. And I also express my gratitude to all of the beings, the trees, the animals, the water that sustain the interwoven tapestry of life, which keeps all of the ecosystems around me flourishing and alive. And now, since I'm joining you all from so far away, I wanted to discuss a little bit of where I am in the world. So as I mentioned to you all before, North America is known in this region by the indigenous communities as Turtle Island. And in many of the myths, of course, the myths and the stories may vary. They say that Sky Woman landed on the back of a turtle. And from there, this continent grew. And of course, the settlers, once they moved onto this land, most settlers mostly from Europe, came and tried to erase all of these histories, all of these stories. But right now, those of us who stand in solidarity, in rebellious cohesion and synergy with the different indigenous nations, also using the name Turtle Island to refer to this part of the continent. And now jumping into exactly where we are on Turtle Island. So we're talking about the St. Lawrence watershed. Where is the St. Lawrence watershed? The St. Lawrence River watershed, it flows from the Great Lakes, these huge, powerful, beautiful bodies of water that hold more than 21% of the world's free-flowing drinking water. And we are right now on Haudenosaunee territory. And the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is the oldest lasting representative democracies or republics in the world. It is formed by right now 6 different nations, indigenous nations, but straddles most of what is now called New York State, and then also goes a little bit into what is now called Canada. So just to give you an idea of where I am situated and a little bit more about this land and water. And right now you have a little picture of where I am in this part of the watershed. So we have, south of me, we have the Adirondack Mountains, beautiful mountains from which waters flow to the great St. Lawrence River. And the St. Lawrence River is known in Mohawk or Kanien'kehá:ka as the Gainiatarowanene, or the Great River. And as I mentioned before, this water is the same water that flows from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. This water has suffered histories upon histories and layers of colonial violence. From the stripping of the Adirondack Mountains of timber in the 1800s to the early 1900s, to the damming of these rivers by large hydroelectric projects, the land has suffered intense violence. But the land has resisted. The trees have grown back, the rivers keep flowing, and now communities across this region are joining together to, one, work with the land, heal the land, and acknowledge that we are all one with this land. And to do this, I want to first also discuss a little bit of some of the extractivist projects that have harmed, and in some cases continue harming, these vital waterways and vital ecosystems. As I mentioned before, the dams in some of the river that flows very close to my house has more than 27 dams that have really, and it's not a very long river, they really cut the flow of the river, that have dissected and divided ecological communities. And these dams, when they were built, caused innumerable ecological disasters. They were built from the 1930s to the middle 1950s. But right now they're seen as stable parts of the community. People don't usually consider what would happen if that dam wasn't there. What would happen to different ecosystems? What would happen to the aquatic connectivity if these rivers were allowed to flow free? And then on the St. Lawrence River, that river that actually divides the settler colonial states, the United States and Canada, there are huge dams. Dams which of course rival many which are in different parts of the world, everywhere from Asia to Southern Africa to Southern Abya South America. All of this dam was one of the first bigger dams, and right now still stands as one of the most disastrous dams in the world. And this picture right now that I'm showing you is when the dam was constructed, and this is the Robert Moses Power Dam. And it was built during the construction of the Seaway Project, in which the Canada and the United States had this overly ambitious dream to turn the Great Lakes, the center of the continent, into a new seaway. And they wanted to do that by creating all of these systems of locks and dams in which ships could come down through the St. Lawrence River and access the industrial cities in the center of the continent. It didn't work. It was a gamble of a lot of money, and they never really got the investment of everything that they spent. Partially because they built the wrong size dams, the wrong size locks. They were not big enough for the larger ships that came later. And also because the energy that actually comes from these dams just was swallowed up by large industrial projects and never actually got to the people that they promised it to. But besides that, these dams also fueled industries, and horribly destructive industries. And I'm just going to talk about three of these. And this is General Motors, which is a name that many of us know, GM, Reynolds Metals Incorporated, and the Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa, which has since changed its name. They're trying to escape their dirty history. And what these companies did was to, of course, poison the land and water. In the area around where these companies were built. And of course, this all happened, the dams were built in the 1950s, this contamination happened after that. But there was a snapping turtle, one of those huge, beautiful turtle that was tested around the early 1990s, late 1980s, that had more than 335 parts per million of PCBs. So polychlorinated biphenyls in its system. And these are toxic heavy metals. And the safe number to have in your system is 2. And this being had 335. And just to give you an idea of what disaster that these factories had on all of the ecosystems. And of course, once it ends up in the water, it poisons everyone, and then it also poisons human bodies. And these dams are right upriver from the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation of Akwesasne. This is an indigenous nation that actually straddles two sides of the settler colonial Canadian-US border. And it almost is unimaginable, the bureaucratic nightmare that this nation had. So they had treaties with both basically the English crown and the American government, in which they would not which they would have sovereignty over this land. However, what did they do after the United States became independent? They put a border right through it, basically almost on purpose to weaken this very powerful nation. And now the people to go to work, to go home, have to cross through the United States-Canada border. And that itself is horrifying. And then just to cap it all off, they built all these factories upstream. So all of the contamination flowed down. And this community sustained itself through fishing, through living off the land. And after they realized that the bodies started to be poisoned, they had to stop doing their traditional practices, living with the land, basically destroying entire ways of living and entire systems of life. So this picture right here just shows different areas of concern, that this nation is facing contamination. Since then, this nation has also had done groundbreaking work in remediating, bringing all of these ecosystems back. They're still doing that work, but still one of this area, just downriver from where I am right now, is one of the most contaminated areas in the continent. This area also is a very heavily agricultural area. And while we are better off than, let's say, most of the world, because as you all know, the United States ships off its pollution, its destruction out of places, we still face a lot of contamination from agriculture. Of course, from pesticides, intense manure runoff. And I right now live in the fields, in cornfields. And here that's one of the main concerns with the waterways, is that all of all of the pesticides and everything flows into the streams. And there's no real effort to stop that. New York State still allows, where I live is New York State, still allows you to dump sewage on top of fields to fertilize them. And we don't know where the sewage really comes from. So all of this process just leads us to the point that the rivers have a lot of intense nutrient content, and we don't really know because there's no really accurate testing of what is happening to these waterways. And this is where we stand now. And as I mentioned, communities in this region, such as the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation, have been standing up to fight and protect these vital and sacred lands and water. And many other people from settler communities are also saying, okay, we need to work together. We need to create a different approach, a different way of working and collaborating with this land. And that is why a number of us, a few years ago, started to bring people together to have vital conversations. And these conversations led to us striving to create a bioregional movement. And this movement is meant to be ecocentric. It is meant to not just focus on the voice of humans as just one species, but in the voice of all of the beings, and to honor the rights of all of these beings, the legal rights, but also honor the relationships that we all have with each other, and these ecosystems, these species have with each other as well. And especially with the water, this powerful entity that brings life to all. And in this process in which we're creating this bioregional movement, I mentioned to you before, what is a little bit about this bioregion, a little bit the hydrology, the ecosystems of this region. And in this movement, we also recognize that there is a border, like I mentioned before, the settler colonial United States-Canada border, that is dividing partitioning communities. 11 minutes from where I am driving, there is a river, the St. Lawrence River, and I look across it and I can see Canada. Some people could even, if they're strong enough, could swim to the other side. Except now, of course, as we know, we cannot cross without the right paperwork, without the right documentation. That itself hinders and is a gigantic weight on these communities. But then again, the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation is itself a nation, has different governments. It's one being, but it has to be divided between different governments beside all of these colonial bureaucracies, New York State, Ontario, Quebec, all of these different entities that are dividing and partitioning people. So because of this, we really wanted to focus on the ecosystems that connect us. And in many cases, you can say that ecosystems stretch from the Adirondack Mountains, which I described to you all before, these mountains which are south of where I am, all the way to the Algonquin, mountains. And we have these different vital ecosystems, these two mountain waves, mountains, and in between we have this powerful river. But then all of these other rivers that flow from the mountains flow into this river, and all of that is connected. We have lots of species that now cannot travel between these different watersheds because of the dams. We have Atlantic salmon, we have the American eel, these species that are vital and play vital roles within these ecosystems that are themselves, like us humans, divided because of these borders that were put by humans. So in this movement, we wanted to break away from that. But that is a very complicated struggle, especially in this part of the continent. So I wanted to share with you the goals that we all had before together amidst our working group. And that was to create a group of youth and elders from across the watershed. And this happened in March of this year. And we brought together different stakeholders from the area to discuss if we were going to create an ecocentric governance system that would kind of almost wash away all of these other self-imposed colonial governance systems. What would that look like? How would we best honor our relationship to all our natural relations, all the non-human communities that make up this watershed, alongside the human communities? How would we create something that was different? And to do that, youth moderated the discussion with their elders. And from that conversation, people were really inspired to do something new, to do something different, and actually draft law. But not just draft law within a single government or within on one side of the border, but in conjunction, collaborating from multiple sides, multiple communities, all working together. And so, as you see here, we tried to write an ecocentric law, collaborated between both settler, which mostly Eurocentric communities, and also indigenous communities. And that process was beautiful and complex, and I'll show you a little bit the result of what happened after. But it was, I think, everyone found that process invigorating, and while very challenging, people really started to weave together communities that have been divided since hundreds and hundreds of years. And why the end goal of that was not just to create a new law, but also to create an alliance. Because we all know with the climate crisis, and as things start getting more and more complex around the globe, there is a tendency to divide. And the gigantic governments are pushing it, the media from all countries around the world are pushing it to divide people, divide communities. But again, we know that in order to survive, we need to follow the lessons of everyone from the bees to the American eel. We need to connect and weave together these alliances across bioregions. And again, how did we decide to do that? We decided to focus on the rivers, because the rivers are these beings that connected entire watersheds. They went up from the mountains, flowed through the fields, and then flowed into the ocean. So how do we connect? We just follow the waterways. We're all made of water. So we just need to follow this being that gave birth to us all and let it bring us where it may go. And based on that process, after we decided that we wanted to make this happen, we actually had a series of workshops. Again, this all happened in this last year, but we had a series of workshops in which we brought different stakeholders together, and we had people that were environmental lawyers that were in their 60s communicate and share knowledge with youth and students who are 14, and the people that were 14 years old communicated with their elders, and they said, no, this law does not work. This doesn't make sense. We need to do it this way. So we had an intergenerational exchange, and we had communities that are actually writing law together. And again, in the beginning process, we did not consider borders. We did not consider boundaries. This law could apply to the entire region. And we would discuss what needed to be included in this law. And the law was focused on the rivers, because we wanted to really stress the fact that these rivers all make us all one, and we need to acknowledge these rivers as entities in their own right. And of course, this functions within the wider rights of nature movement, even though we want to be careful with aligning ourselves completely with that one global movement. Because as a lot of people, especially some of my friends from the Haga Mohawk Nation have told me, is that we need to focus on not just rights, but also roles and responsibilities. What are the roles and responsibilities that we all share with the ecosystems and each other? What roles does the river have? As someone else told me, one of Abraham Francis, one of our collaborators, the river has a right to be listened to. The river has a right to be acknowledged as a living being in of itself, but also has its roles and responsibilities that we need to honor and respect. So in honoring and respecting all roles and responsibilities, we then took the next step of actually striving to go to the different towns, different governments. And the first ones we went to were different settler colonial municipalities in what is now known as New York, United States, and say, why don't you pass a Rights of the River resolution that commits you to drafting ecocentric law that connects people across the region? And you do it in conjunction with others, in conjunction with other communities. And this basically last week, November 10th, the town of Potsdam, New York, which is not a very big town, passed the Racket River Resolution, also known as the Adnahwade River in Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk. Again, forgive my pronunciation. And they did this. There was a unanimous vote. The town board, which is that governance body of this part of the world, said yes to signing a resolution that committed them to creating a law that was ecocentric and that they would work with other communities, humans and non-humans, across the bioregion to make it happen. And our goal from here is to really create more committees, more groups of both students, youth, elders from different parts of the region to say, okay, how do we share information? How do we work together to better protect these waterways that bring life to all? And another thing that came up in these discussions is that, yes, the state, New York State, the federal government, the Canadian government, they all do these different tests of the water. They all try to control little different parts of these watersheds and manage these watersheds. However, what the communities don't do is, so what they don't allow is that the communities take action themselves. The communities don't really have mechanisms to do this research, to listen to the waterways, to communicate with them and protect them. We have universities around us that are doing that work, but there's a lack of connection between the institutions that are doing the research and the communities that need protection and want to stand up and protect these waterways. So in the end goal, we do want to create a bioregional network, a bioregional, not really an organization, but a collaboration in which communities can communicate and say, look, this is what's happening to waterways. We want to work together to be stronger. Be stronger for these waterways, but be stronger for each other. We live in a very, they call it climate safe region. We have lots of water, like much more lucky than many other places in the world. And we know that once those extractivist companies finish this almost destroying other ecosystems, they're going to come here. So in doing this work, we also want to set a good ground standing, a good base for the future, in which we can stand up and protect these ecosystems from the companies that are going to come in later to try to steal this water, steal the energy, steal these resources. But that also, I also want to set a groundwork so that we can become a welcoming space for communities that are forced to move from elsewhere because they lack water, because of wildfires, because of air pollution. We want to create a space that welcomes all, but that also makes sure that these ecosystems are very much loved and protected. And we know that while we are actually drafting law, we know that law itself has power, but it lacks the true inkling to truly protect communities. But the true change doesn't happen in the courtrooms. The true change happens in here, it happens in our hearts. And to make that happen, we need to start this conversation. So we're also working to create spaces in which communities can share through art, share through conversation, and really discuss together. Again, breaking down the barriers, so we just follow the river, go all the way from the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation of Akwesasne, and then travel upriver to all these communities that are divided by borders of nations, borders of economic borders, borders of physical borders like dams, and interconnect them so we can all come together and discuss what needs to happen next. And right now I'm going to share with you all a little bit of one of the results of this process. And of course, right now, this told you that right now governments are starting to pass laws, pass resolutions. But before that, like I mentioned, we drew communities together to actually start drafting the law or blueprint laws so that we can lead into this process. I'm going to show you one of those blueprints, which we have online. Okay, 1 second. I'm just going to, hopefully you all are going to be able to see the next thing I'm going to show you. So right now I'm going to I stopped sharing, but I'm going to share again. Very sorry, 1 second. Here we go. Okay, perfect. So this is one of the blueprints which was created in a collaboration between, again, youth and elders from multiple different communities. And it was for the St. Lawrence River, that river that I mentioned to you all before, that powerful river that divides settler colonial nations, but all unites communities across the region and unites the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean. And again, one mentioning, that we created a Bill of Rights and responsibilities, because we know Bill of Rights is a very heavy term. Rights itself, as we know, is a settler colonial term that was coined in England and different European nations. So we want to think about other ways of referencing what rights are. And of course, this society is built upon the relationships. And we see rights as being basically a crystallization, a concretization of these relationships within a legal sphere. So going back to rights, we take that to mean responsibilities. And we also use two different versions of rights. One is RIGHTS, rights, and the other is RITES, or rituals, because we want to reference also the ancestral knowledge that is the basis of cultures around the world. And so this is just a little bit of our Bill of Rights and Responsibilities for this watershed. Again, this is nothing legally binding, but was created to spur legally binding action later on. The preamble comes from the Ollantaytambo, or the words before all else, which is what people from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy nations, the indigenous communities that are the ancestral stewards of this land, say before most government meetings or official meetings or even ceremonial practices. And this Ollantaytambo is basically the words before else, in which you give thanks to the world around you. And we had an elder, David Orquette, from the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force, who is one of the first indigenous groups to actually go to the UN to speak about the environment. And he wrote this for us, taking words from the Ollantaytambo about water. So here we have a little Thanksgiving address about water, the being that unites us all. And from that preamble, we then dive into what is really known as the whereas section in legal documents, basically stating what we know about these watersheds and these waterways. And of course, we can share this website with you all after, so you can explore at your own leisure. But just basically describing the biodiversity of this region, the different species that make up this region, and how communities from across the region, human communities, have collaborated with their non-human relatives since time immemorial in this region. And how we all recognize that the laws we have in place were settler colonial constructs, and we need to create something new. And that we recognize that nature has rights, and we do them in solidarity with other nations around the world. Of course, recognizing the voice of the watershed itself, what the watershed is, and then referencing the rights that the river has. And it was a complex process, and involved discussions with earth scientists, lawyers, youth, elders, traditional knowledge keepers. And we, of course, have what basically is included in lots of rights of nature legislation: the right to exist, to generate, flourish, evolve, adapt, and thrive, the right to restoration, recovery, and preservation, but also different things that aren't usually included in other legal documents, such as the right to support life and the flow of energy that unites natural communities within the watershed. Other things that were mentioned, which are not mentioned other places, is the right to a cycle of healthy high and low water flows. And this is talking about a river specifically. And this is in the case of all of these rivers in this area that are really managed by dams. And then also basing off of that, we also have different things such as the right to be the right to be free of pollution as far as it affects the ability of the river to fulfill its roles and responsibilities to all its relations. Because we had lots of conversations about pollution, and we know that there's pollution in these waters. So what do we actually say? What are these rights? How do we enshrine the right to be free of pollution inside a document like this, even if a more metaphorical document? And one of our colleagues, again, Abraham Francis, who mentioned that the river needs the ability to fulfill its roles and responsibilities to all its relations. That the river itself has its own roles and responsibilities, and pollution inhibits the river from fulfilling those responsibilities. So again, that is a little unusual language you don't usually see in other Bill of Rights, quote unquote. So going down further, we also have, like we mentioned before, not just rights of the river, but also responsibilities that we have as part of this ecosystem. We are all part of these watersheds, of these bioregions. So what do we need to do with each other? We know that, for example, different fish species fulfill their responsibilities when they travel upstream by providing passage to the freshwater mussels. There is the American eel, which migrates all the way from where it's born in the Atlantic Ocean, the Sargasso Sea, up into the streams here. It hasn't been able to do that because of the dams, which block its passage or kill their bodies in their with its turbines. But that eel connects through with the aquatic connectivity, these ecosystems, and provides passage for other species. So if we were going to fulfill our responsibilities as human beings that we know are not in the society currently, aren't very good at doing that, what would that be? So again, respect the natural cycles and processes of the river, acknowledge our ecological duty to advocate for the river, but also nurture reciprocal relations that foment healthy human and natural communities. And reciprocal relations, of course, mean that there's no take. There's an exchange. There's an equal exchange between us and the ecosystems that we are part of, and that just as we have to be equal to the exchange between people. The nation where I am currently, the United States, is horrible at that, and it takes from the world and has basically almost destroyed the entire world by just taking. There needs to be an equal exchange in every sense of the word, every sense of the word, and that is something that we included in this Bill of Responsibilities. And again, here, protectability of the river to fulfill its roles and responsibilities to all the natural communities that make up the watershed. Because, like we said, the river has its own roles and responsibilities, and the river has the right to fulfill those. And of course, here, just basically calling on the governments to pass ecocentric laws, which is happening. We didn't expect it to happen so quickly. Again, we said this process started in March, and we already have one law that is basically committing the government to create biocentric alliances with other governments. So we are very excited it's happening so fast. And we have just the other night, it was Wednesday night, we had another government to discuss that. And these are small town governments. And we hope to keep this network growing and kind of forget about the state, New York State, forget about the federal government, United States. We know they're corrupt. We know that they're just meant to impose and control and colonize. We want to really create another network that breaks apart, like we mentioned before, the borders and really unites communities in a bioregional effort. And to do that, we also are uniting communities to say that they're watershed guardians. And right now we have communities from around, basically groups or individuals from around the watershed that are starting to stand up and say why they want to be watershed guardians. And to kind of end the conversation with you all today, I'm just going to share with you some of those voices. And to let you know that it is a regional collaboration. We even have a small dam operator, hydro dam operator, who recognizes his own positionality and says, I want to do better. And here, like he says, sustainability requires that the needs of the interrelated communities be respected. The use of rivers for water, power, and habitation will only contribute to a healthy world if it is done in ways that help and support the natural ecosystem, plants, and animals. And then just going to jump to some other voices just to share with you different perspectives from across the region. Let's see, one that would make sense. We have the waterways are the veins of our Mother Earth, and she should be cared for and respected. Setioka Bucktooth, Snipe Clan Botanicals, again from the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation. We have people that are in different town governments, and they're going to end right now with Lee Wilbanks. who was one of our closest friends and dearest collaborators, who used to be the Upper St. Lawrence River keeper. And he said, waters and waterways have and will exist independent of humans. The question is, do we continue to degrade them to the detriment of the web of life they support, which includes us? Or do we accept the responsibility to live alongside them in a reciprocal and beneficial way humans did for thousands of years before we colonized asserted a false dominion over all nature? And that is what is really uniting us. That's really uniting our effort as we strive to create reciprocal relations with each other. As we know, human beings are, currently that is not the high point in human society, but also with the other beings that live alongside us. We are all just these macrocosms of microbes, fungi, viruses. We are all, ourselves are made up of water and all of these other minerals and elements. And we're in communication with all the elements around us. And to really connect these worlds, connect and strive together, we need to, again, like I said, break down the barriers. And I'm gonna finally end with a statement that was shared to me by a storyteller, Alejandro Beltran Cordero, who lives right now in another watershed, in the Antigua watershed in Veracruz, what is known as Mexico, Totonac, Nahua territory. And he usually uses the metaphor of a swarm of bees, and swarm, I can kind of give like a negative connotation, but a swarm in his sense is this cloud of connectivity. It's in a sense a bioregion or a watershed in which all of these individuals are working together, one and the other, to strive to create beautiful futures. Every single of those bees keeps forests alive, keeps landscapes alive, keeps ecosystems alive by the pollen, the flowers that they pollinate, the nectar that they pass on in this intercycle and web of life. And we all are, you all who are joining on this call, myself, part of this wider global swarm. And we're all uniting together, and each of us individually does our own little part, passes our own little bit of pollen. But together we are powerful. And while I'm described to you all a bioregional movement and a bioregional effort around the world, as you all know, people such as yourselves are striving to do similar things. And it is in these conversations, it is in talking together like now that the borders can come down and we can all pollinate and bring life to a beautiful future to come for the entire planet and all life. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Wow, I think it was extremely powerful words and great presentations, Vincent. Thank you so much. It was extremely thought-provoking and inspiring for us. We, as the South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group, have been discussing some of these concepts, and definitely what you guys have been doing is the immediate goal for us as well, to look and identify certain communities and start beginning to connect with the governments and see how our cultures and our borders can be unified once again, how we are supposed to be existing in nature. Many congratulations to you for having some headways in getting connected with the governments, and hoping for more success along the way. We'll open it up for discussion, but yeah, I have one question for you, which you could choose to answer right away or after listening to a couple of more questions, is what would be your key learnings in mobilizing this process in terms of drafting the law, as well as mobilizing communities and having dialogues between youth and the elderly? What has been your overall experience and learnings is something I would like to personally hear, but opening up for others to also share their comments inside.
Thank you so much for that question. And I think the main takeaway, something that I myself personally learned, is the true value in conversation. And usually one can say there's a lot of talk and no action. That if you just spend all the time sharing together by verbally and you don't stand up and actually are doing things, that is detrimental to a movement. In our case, we really wanted to take things at the speed of relationships. and really not force relationships, force actions, and really work on things step by step by step. And though every single of those steps is a different conversation. And another thing that we also learned is that to make those conversations happen, we really need to bring as many voices into the room as possible, recognizing, of course, that people have very busy schedules. Now with technology and the way it's so easy to do things, we have even busier schedules than before, so it's even harder to bring people into the same room. But you have to be persistent. You have to build on the networks that you all have. And of course, you all are so good at, you all know this, but build the networks that you have. And really, as each of those different strings, when you can, start to weave them together. And in the work that we did, we really wanted to have the voices of youth be the center and focus. So the beginning organizing was that. It was bringing the different youth groups, bringing the different people onto the table and have them start. And our dream was that they would write the law, that they would write the ecocentric law for the different communities. Of course, once we got to a certain point, people had courses, they got busy. So in the end, some of the youth went on their own way, but a lot of them stayed. And then other people, the elders, the different people in the community jumped on board to try to bring that process home. And then as we tried to create these events, all these conversations, we really made sure that there's different people at the table, that there was always a youth member present, that there's always someone from a different community present, so that there was no one really excluded from the different conversations, and that they could really create more and more action. And then we outreach to the world, to everybody that we could, to learn. So we contacted people the world over. We reached out to watershed guardians the world over and try to bring them in to hear their opinions, but also within our own region, within our bioregion, we made sure to connect with everybody. And some of those connections stuck. And again, connection by connection, we had a politician that joined one of our events. They championed the law forward. So it just kept on cycling. But it was really, there wasn't no magic to it except what human beings have done for millennia. Step by step, relationship by relationship, never pushing, just letting everything flow like the rivers.
No, it's beautiful. And I think our group also has been going with the same vibe of taking relationship by relationship and going with the flow. I just want to once just kind of logistic thing that Vasudha is sending across everyone panelist links so that they can continue to talk and share their videos. So please do accept and
yeah, and you can also like unmute yourself if that's what you're more comfortable with. I've even given that now. So yeah.
right. Okay. Please raise your hand virtually or otherwise.
Thank you for your sharing. Actually, quite a insightful sharing, and also it also resonates quite a lot in our work also here in the Himalayas as to, in a way, how the larger Himalayas as a kind of bioregion also has so much of connected geographies and connected histories. And when you mention also about the importance of oral histories, it's also very, very profound in a sense as to how it is important to preserve those and this international sharing that, you know, the international sharing and the caring that happens, the conversations that are happening is very, very encouraging actually. And I just wanted to also maybe, you know, ask you to maybe also reflect on how does the sovereignty of nation states, for example, how does that impact your work? Like how does that imposition, the symbols of sovereignty, how does that impact on lawmaking, for example, by the community or on conversations around the community on making your laws around the ecosystems that you are having? Because at the end of the day, you know, that is what is also ever present as well. So maybe also would like to hear your views on that. And also a second thing would also be, I was interested in the use of your serpents and, you know, and some illustrations which were looking like some, you know, serpents, dragons and all of that, which also I just wanted to hear the story behind such, because we also heard from the Australian indigenous communities as well about similar stories from that. So I was very intrigued in that as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for your beautiful question. And yes, when it comes to the work that we do, like you mentioned before, oral history storytelling is a pivotal point in bringing these communities together. That's another way that we interconnect all of these that's how we, well, basically I myself am an artist storyteller, so I think I see the value, the deep value in making these stories come to play, and also looking at all the storytellers, not just the human storytellers, but talking about sovereignty. And that's a complicated issue in this part of the world, especially because we have two different nations, whether it be Canada and the United States, that are deep colonial impositions. But there's a sovereignty that we acknowledge and we defer to, which is the sovereignty of the indigenous nations. And specifically in our part of the watershed, not the entire watersheds, but in our part of the watershed, it is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation. And their government structure is divided between 6 different nations or 6 different tribes. And the tribe where the territory that we are is the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk tribe. And the nation that's closer to us is called Akwesasne, or as the Partridge Drums. And it's named after the rapids that flowed before they created the dam that I told you about before. And in this process, the United States and Canada, and also the different subdivisions, so New York State, Ontario and Quebec, have all imposed their sovereignty again and again on this nation. And in this work, what we really want to do also is not say that because we're doing this, our action here will impose anything on our neighbors to the north from the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation. We respect and defer to their sovereignty, and our goal is for that they lead our efforts. The government is divided between 3 different Canada, so Ontario, Quebec, and New York State, but also it's divided in half. But they also have 3 different government structures. One of them is the one in New York State, which is the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, and Canada, Akwesasne Mohawk Council, the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, and then they have the traditional hereditary structure, so the Mohawk Council of Chiefs. 3 different governments. And the work we're doing in collaboration with them is we're saying, okay, we're doing this work here, but as allies, as in solidarity with you all, we don't want to impose anything. We're just here presenting this idea that we all are working on together. And from that point on, we can collaborate and make things happen. And we don't want to strip away any sovereignty from anyone. However, what we do want to focus on is the sovereignty of communities, because the United States government likes to say we have our sovereignty here, and we're going to impose it on everybody else. We also know that New York State does the exact same thing and doesn't let communities take actual action. It has more freedom than other places in this country, but not a lot. So we want to say communities have their own sovereignty, meaning that they can stand up for their watersheds and their bioregions. And that itself is a complicated process. I can talk to that more if you want legally, because the government and federal government, New York State also control technically the local governments, but we are saying that no, that the local governments can decide. We'll see if we bring that to court. Actually, what happens, we may lose, but it doesn't matter because we're starting the groundwork of saying we can control our own communities, and we all are part of these ecosystems, so we need to stand up for them. Sorry for that long response. Oh, and for the art is made by myself and my partner, Blake Lavia. We both are artists and storytellers. We made the art. And we really wanted in our art to share the voices of all the storytellers, not just the human storytellers, which is where the image of the dragon or the snake imagery comes in. Sorry for that long question. Anybody else?
Thank you. I think Srishti had raised her hand. Srishti, would you like to go?
Yes, I did, but I had a very similar question as that of Mirza's, which I think partly has been answered. But I just wanted to say that I've been in touch with Sensory for 1 year or so, and they have been sharing such amazing art. And it was so nice to see it all through the presentation. So thanks so much for this very inspiring work.
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we could move to Kirti next. Kirti, you can
Yeah.
unmute and
Hi, this is Kirti from Bangalore, India. I'm a PhD student working on forest ecosystems. So I could really connect with your talk. I also work with communities, tribal communities in Bannerghatta National Park. So my question is the ecocentric law. You think it will work in third world countries where, I mean, the development still comes
Kirti,
like
your
of
voice
laws.
is
So
cracking. Yeah, maybe if you could keep your video off for a bit, I think that will
should
help.
I repeat the question?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly now. Yeah, please repeat.
Yeah, the question is like, see, I am a PhD student working on national park forest ecosystem near Bangalore. It's called Bannerghatta National Park. And I also worked with tribal communities. And I mean, I could really connect to the talk. I quite saw most of it in my study area. So my question is the ecocentric laws, how would they work in third world countries? Is it a practical thing? I mean, it is definitely really good if such a thing comes up, but what will be the implementation issues? Because most of the development in third world countries still comes from exploitation of, say, natural resources. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
And thank you so much for your question. Thank you so much for your expertise and everything and what you shared. Of course, I am speaking from this country right now. So I defer to the expertise of people like you all who are doing the very amazing and hard work in your bioregions and with your watersheds in your communities. I do come originally from Guamere territory, what is known as Mexico. Again, I'm myself, I'm a settler in this land. I have moved up here as an adult. So I can only say that the work that has been done other places regarding ecocentric laws. And it's been positive and negative, or there's been a mixed bag. If you probably are mostly aware of the different cases in Ecuador, where rights of nature of the Pachamama, Mother Earth, has been enshrined in their constitution. And there, once that happened, after they rewrote their constitution and they drafted everything in 2008, there was a lot of cases in which exploitation just continued. There was no real change. However, we are now seeing the different courts, in particular the Constitutional Court, actually pass or actually prohibit different actions, such as the Los Cedros case, which has happened this past year, in which they said the mining companies could not really exploit the natural world in the Los Cedros National Park, and that set a precedent for all the different places where the mining was happening. And they actually were shutting down mines because of this one court case. So I think that it really is in its own infancy, like as you described, the exploitation is continuing, as where you all are, or depending, I'm not sure where you all are, but in many other cases in what is known as the so-called developing world, there is exploitation happening at a much more faster pace than here. Here we're luckier, much more lucky because exploitation happened 50, 100 years previously. However, we're very aware that it's happening at a very subtle level here. And that in this country, we have even harder time than others passing ecocentric laws. Other countries have been more successful. Here, we have been trying to do things at the regional, local level because the state, federal government will never consider it. And it hasn't been that successful. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with the case for the White Earth Band of Ojibwe Nation, indigenous community, within what is now Minnesota, in the central part of the continent. And they passed a law to grant rights to the wild rice, or Menominee, as they knew. And there, they would use that law to sue Enbridge Extension, which is a tar sand gas pipeline that wanted to come all the way from the Alberta tar sands, what is known as Canada, all the way down and be transported and ruin a lot of the world, because when that oil gets burnt, and it is being burnt now, is released into the atmosphere, it's going to spell horribleness for the entire planet. So they use that law to try to sue the state of Minnesota for leasing 5 billion gallons of water to Enbridge Extension pipeline through tribal laws and tribal treaties, talking about sovereignty here, an indigenous nation saying, this is our land, we have treaty rights on this land, you cannot do this. And the federal government just recently threw that case out. So it's hard. We don't really know how it can work, but we want to try. And that's where we stand at the moment. And again, you all are familiar with your areas much more than I am, but where I see it as a movement in the right direction. Even if we can't change the law right now, make it work, at least we start that process.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Simson. And also, I would like to take your permission that if anyone else from the group or others who are joining us today would like to respond to that question of how this could be possible in third world countries or in a region like South Asia, because we have few examples, so maybe Srishti or Ashishji, if you would like to interject and share some of those successful examples for KP.
Yeah, sorry, should I go, Namrata? I saw Vasudha's hand up before mine, so I don't know whether she wants to. Vasudha,
if you wanted to respond to Kirti's question also.
I can do it. I can do it when I also ask some questions with since.
Yeah.
Vasudha, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, first of all, that was such a beautiful presentation. I was completely immersed in it, and I just couldn't I couldn't get my eyes off the screen. The images were so beautiful. So thanks for giving us that experience. It was like a journey altogether. Second, I was strolling and I wanted to know a little bit more about this term that's there. And I think it's a local term, but I just wanted to get some context about it. AXA, 1 minute, trying to read it. 1 minute. Akwesasne. I wanted to understand a little bit more about it.
So Akwesasne is the nation I mentioned to you all before. It is that Mohawk, the Mohawk Ganinga. Mohawk is the way that it's referred to now in English, but how they refer to themselves is the Ganinga Haga nation, the Mohawk nation. And the Akwesasne, as I mentioned before, is that nation that was contaminated and polluted by the different factories, Alcoa, GM, Reynolds Metals Incorporated, that were powered by the dams. So when I showed you all that little map of the area that was contaminated, that is Akwesasne. And it is one of several Mohawk nations. There's almost too many to list at the moment right now, but that's the one that's closest to us. And those are our primary collaborators. And in working and doing this work, we are doing it in solidarity and working with them to make it happen as settler communities, meaning where I am right now, and the Mohawk Nation of Akwesasne, we're all working together on this. And hopefully their dream of many people there that we know is to also pass ecocentric law. But again, that would have to be done through 3 different governments because they were divided in half as the Canadian-US border. So that is Akwesasne. And thank you so much for asking. Again, and it means, like I said before, we're the partridge drums. The partridge is a bird. And the image of it is flapping its wings, which is the sound of the rapids, of the gigantic waterfall that was silenced when they built the dam. And that's Akwesasne.
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe just a quick response to Kirti, and then I have 3 small questions to Sinsun. So Kirti, I think your question is absolutely right. We are in countries like India, which, by the way, we no longer refer to ourselves as third world. That's a very derogatory term, but you can say the global south. That in countries like India, the push for economic growth based development is really, really strong, and even stronger in the last few years than before. And so to actually have the recognition of ecocentrism is a very difficult process. So in that sense, you're right. But I think it may also be a bit easier in countries like ours because there is still a strong sense of ecocentrism in Adivasi, indigenous and local communities, which has been lost quite significantly in the much more industrialized West. And so if one actually builds or integrates local community collective rights, such as what the Forest Rights Act does, along with their continuing cosmologies or worldviews or governance systems, it may be very feasible and possible to actually build ecocentric laws. And by laws here, I'm talking about a much broader definition of laws, not just what's in the statutes, but also customs or customary law and norms and governance patterns and systems and rules that local communities also build. So in fact, the movement for community conserved areas, or ICCAs as they are known globally, is to provide this recognition and to strengthen communities on the ground to enforce the recognition of such customs, even if it's not actually in a statutory law. So I think that's the way to go. And we've seen at least some movement, for instance, with the Dongriakond indigenous community in Odisha against the mining corporation Vedanta, where their argument was not just about their livelihoods, but also about the spiritual deities of the land and the spiritual existence of the landscape itself as something that could not be violated. And so therefore they would not allow the mining to take place. And that was successfully argued even up to the Supreme Court. So there is some precedence which actually can be used. Zinsun, I echo everybody else's voices about the really inspiring presentation you made, both in terms of, I think, what you said and also what you showed, the visual and the text and spoken. So thanks a lot for that. I wish we could have had a much longer session, maybe another time. But I have 3 questions for you. One, is the community itself, the indigenous nations that you speak about, are they more or less united on this issue, or are there divisions within the community? Because we know that from the Indian or South Asian context, the amount of money that comes in for many of these so-called development projects is so great, and also the power that is coming from above, that it manages to sway or convince or force people from within our own communities to jump onto that side, right? So it creates these divisions within the community. So how is it in your area? That's one question. The second is, in the decision making that you do, whatever decisions are taken with regard to this whole issue, how do you bring the voice of the river in? Who represents the river, or the fish in the river, or wildlife in the river or around the river? Who actually brings that voice in, and how? And the third is, when you were listing the rights in your declaration, it struck me that, I mean, there's a fantastic set of rights, but it struck me that they were all or mostly somewhat, what should I say, instrumental, for lack of a better word. I don't mean that in a negative way, but they were instrumental in the sense of the functions of the rivers and things like that. But what about the spiritual rights of the rivers? Or the rights as, and Srishti can explain this better, one of the young students that we spoke to up in Ladakh, the sort of northernmost part of India, when we spoke about the rights of Indus River, she said the river has the right to sing. And then somebody else said the river has the right to play. So would those also figure in the sort of cosmological understanding of your nations there? And if so, would those also not fit into the declaration? Thanks. Mirza has added the right to be a moody river. Yeah, up where he is, that's quite a issue. Yeah, sorry, please go on.
No, yeah, I love the right of the Moody River. Love the right of the river to play and to sing. So to start from the question one by one, when it comes to, I also agreeing, of course, saying with everything that you mentioned before, that some of the movements that you just mentioned in discussing how different ecocentric perspectives have taken place around the world is actually what inspires us. And also referencing that, yes, it is in this part of the world where the true spirit of the world around us has been so silenced by the colonialist extractivist cultures, it is very complicated to organize. And it's very complicated to organize at a larger level because everything has been commoditized into objects in a way that is devastating and horrifying. And of course, the United States is trying to do that everywhere around the world. But we see the result here in the culture, which does feel like it's at times it feels like it's lacking energy. It's lacking even strength to communicate and move forward because of this lack of connection. And jumping into that, from that area to the relationships of the different people in the different nations where we're collaborating with. So we're collaborating mostly with the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation. And the conversation there, again, we're going by the speed of relationships. We're not striving to push any ideas forward. We're doing listening, listening and talking, and wherever things happen, they happen. So far we have not found lots of resistance. But of course, as we know around the world, when a different company comes in or different power comes in and they are offering money and jobs and all of these other things, and controversies start to arise. We see this specifically with the Chippy or the Lake Champlain Hudson River project, in which they want to bring power from Hydro-Quebec, from mega dams to build way up north on unceded indigenous land in what is now known as Upper Quebec, Canada. I want to bring that to power New York City. And that's a very complicated project. They want to create all of they went through a gigantic, beautiful lake and beautiful river. They want to create these like tubes where they transport energy, and it's like they'll dredge river that had lots of even nuclear contaminants. It would be horrible for the human and natural communities that live there. But they're also going to do that, taking energy from land that was stolen from indigenous nations. But the co-owner of that project is another, I'm not going to say names right now because I don't want to, but another indigenous nation now just co-owns that transmission line. So you have these confrontations that happen continuously. I'm not from any of these nations I mentioned, so I want to be very careful in speaking about these different nations. But I want to say that right now where we are, the nation, the Akwesasne nation that was mentioned before, has fought very hard for their communities. Of course, every community has its own divisions, but has striven to protect these waterways. And we see them as a shining light and as a guiding force for the area here, because they have acted and the settler communities here haven't. They have stricter water regulations. We don't. So right now they're the guiding force and they're leading us. And in the work that we do, we really try to follow their step, and the language we use, we follow their step, every step of the way. And then, okay, I'm thinking of the third question. Remind me of the second question again.
Second was, how is the voice of the river or the species in the river, how is that brought into decision making? Beautiful.
Thank you so much. And something that was taught to us, again, by someone, Abraham Francis, I mentioned him before. He is one of our main collaborators from the Kanien'kehá:ka Akwesasne Mohawk Nation. And he spoke to us and said, the river has a right to be listened to. We need to find a way to communicate with the river. How does the river take part in this decision-making process? And how can the river be listened to? And in the work that we're doing, we really strive to really make that, again, we are just human. We're putting words, people can put very easily words into the river's mouth. And that's a very dangerous step because we're just deciding it through our own subjectivity, our own positionality. So we really want to leave, in our decision-making, the space open to let those voices come through. And that's a very abstract process. We don't really have a system in place. And we were a little bit scared to develop a system in place to really make sure if we create a structure of how that would happen, we were afraid that then it would be just another human-imposed barrier. But we really want to make the listening a huge component, listening to these waterways, listening to these ecosystems, and people can do that in whatever way they see fit. It can be sitting by the river. It can be doing, if they're a scientist and that's how they interact with the waterway, it can be doing respectfully that research that then brings in that part to the discussion, looking at the ecosystem health, whatever that means. We have lots of scientists on our board, on our group, so they like to share that part of things. But we also have lots of non-scientists to try to bring these different voices into perspective, and through human discussion, try to find a way to let the space open so that other entities can speak. And of course, it's hard because it's like silencing all your thoughts. It's almost impossible. Human beings like to talk. They like to think. So it's a really abstract process, but really involves kind of balancing out the human perspectives, the traditional, quote unquote, traditional science with the other different ancestral knowledge bases, and try to find the opening space for the river to speak. And then when you mentioned the part about the rights being instrumental, could not agree more. I myself am not a lawyer. I've learned a lot about law and can answer questions about the actual law if you want, but I'm not a lawyer. I I started this as a storyteller, as an artist. So I believe that the river can speak through many different ways. And personally, I believe that the river can speak best not through the human voice and not through human law. It can speak best with images, with words, with emotions, with actions. That's how the river can speak to a certain degree. And the river has the right to sing, has the right to play. A lot of people said those things. And a lot of those things didn't actually meant to the final document because we really were gearing it towards the governments and we wanted to make the governments pass this. But in our heart, we did hold together very dearly those other elements because we truly, I personally believe that we need to leave space for the spirits of this land to speak. And I don't want to say that for the whole movement because not everyone has to hold those beliefs. When it comes to the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation, they taught us about the roles and responsibilities, and that's the language we use because that's the language that they use. And we do that in solidarity with them, not appropriating, but just working together in sync with them. However, I don't want to impose my own belief on the entire movement, but I personally would say that yes, the river spirit, the spirit of this world, they need the space to work. And actually the work that Blake and I do, the artwork should try to honor that. So, but thank you for your questions. Hopefully we can even work better to try to make those voices heard, to make the law less instrumental, and to try to allow more space for the river to speak during our decision-making processes. And I thank you so much for your questions because it will help us move forward.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, if anyone else would like to go, please feel free to unmute and share the way. Okay. So meanwhile, maybe Simran, if you have any questions for our group and if you would like to know anything from us, please feel free to ask.
No, I thank you all so much for everything you shared. Well, for letting me be here today, for letting me share, but also everything you shared and all the questions that you asked. Just to ask you all right now, because it's people joining us from different watersheds, different parts of your bioregion, different bioregions. How do you, and anyone can answer this, but as you move forward, creating your bioregional movement, how do you all hope to let the ecosystem speak? I don't know if you all have anything you would like to share about how you all see that process, because I think as us humans with all of the thoughts in our brain, the more we learn from others, the better. How do you all see that? How can the ecosystem speak in this human decision-making process?
The floor is open.
I think what comes to my mind also continuously when we talk about ecosystems and community, in a way, I think we also have to concentrate and also, in a way, meditate, in a way to see as to how we can listen to ecosystems. And I think then we can, and that is also learning how to listen to ecosystems is very, very important to me, actually, and my work. So in that sense, I think it's a combination of both. Maybe not a direct answer to that, but yeah, I think we also need to learn how to listen to that more carefully, more, purposively.
And just to add what Mirza was saying, one is, of course, being able to develop that practice for ourselves of how do we listen to the ecosystems, but also possibly listening to those who have been speaking to those ecosystems as well. So there are in several communities people who have been speaking to these spirits in the forest, to the mountains, to others till date. So how do we begin to actually listen to them of what they're speaking, what those mountains are telling? So the earlier example that Ashish was giving about Niyamgiri in central India, where the communities fought for resisted against this mining project. They were saying that they're listening to the mountain, and the mountain is saying that you cannot mine, you need to ask the mountain. So it's a very different way of understanding. So how do we also begin listening to those communities and stand in solidarity with them in their struggles is, I think, another way of listening to these ecosystems.
I think in that sense, maybe the additional thing would be, and we haven't really done much on that yet, is to enable the voices of children to come into this, because both what I said earlier, which Shrishti and I were lucky enough to hear, which is the right to sing and the right to play, were from children, maybe 9, 10-year-old, 12-year-old children in Ladakh. And in that sense, the kind of maybe innocence is the wrong word, or maybe it is the right word, I don't know. The connect between children who are actually living in or with natural ecosystems and haven't yet been educated out of their connection, so to speak. In some way, I think to be able to enable those voices to also come into public discourse and decision making. I don't quite know how, but that's something that I think we should all think about a bit more. And I think though our cultural, geographic context, economic contexts are so different between your situation, Sinsun, and ours, some of the fundamental elements are the same. And so as you develop further your own ways of listening to and articulating what the river is saying or other species are saying and what your own community members are saying, and then also developing further the skills of being able to deal with the world that is seeing the river only in a instrumentalist way, or is dividing rivers and communities through political boundaries. As you develop those skills further, or as we develop those skills further, I think the more we are able to continue exchanging with each other and talking to each other and learning from each other, I think the more powerful in the right way we would become. So in that sense, I think this connection is really important, even though we are so far away geographically and culturally, but there's also so much proximity in so many fundamental ways, right? So I think with the South Asia Bioregionalism Group, connecting to your network, connecting to the Amazon Sacred Headwaters effort in Latin America, and many others, I think we can just become better and better at what we're trying to do and more holistic. So these are really very important connections, I think.
All right. If there are no more questions and comments or insights, we could, it's an super early morning for Vincent, so we could allow him to rest. But thank you so much for sharing extremely thought-provoking and inspiring presentation, and especially your art is going to stay with us. Extremely beautiful. Do pass our comments and insights to Blake as well. He couldn't join us today, but we do appreciate it. And I think the presentation was a combination of both of your work. So thank you so much. And we'll continue to stay connected with you, both of you, and also others who have joined us today in the conversation. Please do connect and share more insights on these topics and conversations. If you have any suggestions, or if you know of a community working on looking at bioregional approach, or if you have ideas on how ecosystems can be heard, please do share those ideas with us, and we'll see how to have a conversation around it. So I think that's from me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Thank
And
you.
yes, more collaboration. And we'll let you know more groups. But yes, we're weaving this together. Thank you so much for everything you've taught me today, for sharing, and more collaboration.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Before you leave, I wanted to say that, I mean, since you are here, that like I wanted to like my comment on the rivers would like on like what I expect relationship with the nature would be is also to like rupture like saddened relationships. Because I've grown up in a city and I grew up with a river that's completely polluted and really damaged. So it's also learning to have healing relationships and understanding like the trauma behind our river. Yeah. Since you were here, I thought I might as well add my comment.
That makes complete sense. And yes, we all need, especially those of us who live in areas where the ecosystems that we all are part of have been so harmed by human action. Yes, it's necessary to have that healing relationship. And like everybody said, the different processes of listening and everything like that. But yes, couldn't agree with you more.
It was nice listening to you. It was like
Wonderful.
such a beautiful conversation.
Bye.
Bye. Have a great evening, great weekend.